Welcome to the quantum signal. Something shifted while you were asleep, and if you're feeling it now, this message is for you. Don't ignore the signs, your timeline is already moving. Subscribe to Quantum Signal, like this video, and comment aligned if you feel the shift. The moment you woke up, something felt different, even if your rational mind could not immediately label it, because when the Arcturians adjusted your timeline overnight, the shift did not arrive as noise or chaos, but as a silent reordering of probability itself, a subtle recalibration of the quantum pathways that define how your life unfolds. And this kind of change is not perceived through ordinary senses, but through an inner knowing that hums beneath thought, a quiet recognition that the trajectory you are on has been refined, tightened, and brought into a clearer resonance with a higher pattern. During the final hours of the night, when the collective human mind loosens its grip and the subconscious opens like a field without fences, your personal quantum field became more coherent. And coherence is the key condition under which advanced intelligences such as the Arcturians can interact without interference, because coherence allows information to be transferred not as force, but as alignment, not as intrusion, but as synchronization. The Arcturians do not arrive in the way the human imagination expects. They do not descend dramatically or announce themselves with spectacle, because their mode of contact operates through the architecture of time itself, adjusting the probabilities that sit ahead of you like branching paths, gently closing some, amplifying others, and reweighting the future so that the version of reality you step into carries less distortion and more clarity. When this happens, memory can feel strange, as if certain emotional charges have been drained from past experiences, not erased but neutralized, and this is one of the first signs that a timeline adjustment has occurred, because emotional charge is the glue that binds consciousness to particular loops, and when that glue dissolves, you are free to move forward without repeating the same lessons in the same way. You may have noticed that thoughts which once felt heavy no longer hook into you with the same intensity, or that decisions which once caused confusion now feel oddly obvious, and this is not coincidence, but the result of a higher-order intelligence recalibrating the informational field around you so that feedback becomes cleaner and signals become stronger. The Arcturians work with what could be called quantum ethics, meaning they do not impose outcomes but optimize alignment, responding only when a consciousness reaches a threshold where interference would no longer violate free will but instead enhance it, and that threshold is coherence, the state in which your thoughts, emotions, and intentions begin to oscillate in harmony rather than contradiction. During the night, as your conscious defenses rested, your field entered a window of receptivity, and in that window the Arcturian intelligence interfaced with the probabilistic structure of your timeline, not changing who you are, but clarifying who you are becoming, reducing noise, smoothing turbulence, and allowing a more precise future signal to propagate backward through time into your present awareness. This backward propagation is why the shift can feel like a sudden knowing without evidence, a sense that something has already been decided at a deeper level, because in quantum systems, future states influence present conditions just as present actions influence the future, and the Arcturians are masters of this temporal feedback loop. The universe itself responds to such adjustments almost immediately, not through miracles but through pattern shifts. Conversations align more easily, obstacles dissolve without struggle, and synchronicities appear not as surprises but as confirmations, because when a timeline is refined, the universe no longer needs to shout to get your attention, it only needs to whisper. You might feel drawn toward new information, new places, or new internal questions that were not accessible before, and this pull is not random curiosity but a navigational signal emerging from your newly adjusted path, a signal that carries less friction because it is now supported by the structure of the field rather than resisted by it. The Arcturians are often described as guides, But this term is incomplete because they do not guide from above or outside, they guide from within the lattice of reality itself, adjusting the angles at which experiences intersect your awareness so that growth occurs through insight rather than suffering, through recognition rather than repetition. When they adjusted your timeline overnight, they were responding to a readiness that had been building quietly, perhaps through periods of confusion, exhaustion, or inner questioning, all of which serve to loosen rigid identities and create space for reconfiguration. Because a rigid system cannot be optimized without breaking, but a flexible system can be refined smoothly. This is why the shift did not feel dramatic, why there was no thunder or collapse, because the work was surgical, precise, and deeply respectful of your autonomy, altering not events themselves but the likelihood of certain events converging in particular ways, nudging you toward a version of your future that carries greater coherence between your inner truth and outer reality. As the quantum field around you stabilizes into this new configuration, your intuition becomes sharper, not louder but clearer. Because intuition is essentially the ability to read subtle probabilities, and when the noise is reduced, the signal becomes unmistakable. You may begin to notice that choices now come with an immediate bodily response, a sense of expansion or contraction that feels trustworthy, and this is a direct consequence of timeline refinement, because your nervous system is now synchronized with a more accurate map of where each choice leads. The Arcturians do not remove challenge from the path, but they remove unnecessary distortion, allowing challenges to function as gateways rather than traps, as invitations rather than punishments. And this reframing is one of the most profound gifts of their involvement, because it transforms the way consciousness evolves through experience. As this chapter unfolds within you, the realization may dawn that the universe has not suddenly changed its rules, but that you have been repositioned within it, standing now at a vantage point where patterns are easier to read and meaning is easier to extract, and this is the true nature of the adjustment that occurred overnight. You are not on a new planet, in a different dimension, or in a fantasy reality. You are on a refined timeline within the same universe, one that is closer to your authentic frequency, less burdened by inherited distortions, and more responsive to conscious intention. The reason this matters now, and not years from now, is because timeline adjustments cascade, meaning the initial refinement sets off a series of secondary alignments that unfold over time, each one reinforcing the last, creating momentum that can feel both exhilarating and unsettling, because clarity demands responsibility and alignment demands honesty. The Arcturians understand this, and that is why their intervention is timed not by external calendars, but by internal readiness, by the moment when a consciousness is capable of sustaining a clearer path without collapsing back into old loops. If you are listening to this now, it is because your field has already crossed that threshold, and the sensations, thoughts, and subtle shifts you are experiencing are not symptoms of confusion but indicators of recalibration, signs that the universe is now speaking to you in a language you can finally understand. This chapter is not meant to convince you of something external, but to activate a recognition of something internal. A remembrance that your life is not a random sequence of events, but a dynamic conversation between consciousness and cosmos. And that sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, when the mind rests and the heart opens, that conversation deepens, and the timeline itself listens and responds. When the Arcturians adjusted your timeline overnight, the change did not operate through emotion, belief, or imagination alone, but through precise mechanics embedded within the quantum structure of reality itself. And understanding this does not require technical language so much as a shift in perspective, because what occurred was not mystical in the sense of being vague, but subtle in the sense of being foundational. Every human life exists within a field of probabilities, an invisible architecture where countless potential futures coexist as informational patterns, and what you experience as choice is actually your consciousness moving through this probability field, selecting paths through resonance rather than force. The Arcturians are not bound to linear time as humans are, and because of this, they perceive timelines not as straight lines, but as braided streams, constantly interacting, diverging, and converging. And from this vantage point, adjustment does not mean rewriting history, but redistributing probability density, increasing coherence along certain pathways, while allowing others to fade naturally. During the night, when your conscious identity softened and the brain entered slower oscillatory states, your personal field became accessible at a deeper level. And this access is crucial, because high-frequency intelligences cannot interact directly with chaotic systems without amplifying instability. The Arcturians wait for coherence not as permission, but as compatibility, because only a coherent field can receive refined information without distortion, and that is exactly what occurred as your awareness drifted beyond surface thought. At that moment, your timeline was not changed so much as tuned, like an instrument whose strings had drifted slightly out of alignment through accumulated stress, expectation, and inherited conditioning, and the tuning brought you back into resonance with a truer harmonic that had always been present but partially masked. One of the most misunderstood aspects of timeline adjustment is the belief that it produces instant external change. But the Arcturians understand that reality reorganizes from the inside outward, meaning the first shifts occur in perception, interpretation, and internal feedback loops, and only later crystallize into observable circumstances. This is why, after the adjustment, the world may look the same, yet feel subtly unfamiliar, as if you are seeing it through clearer glass, because perception itself has been recalibrated to align with a more accurate probability map. Memory plays a critical role in this process, because memory is not static storage, but an active filter that shapes how the present is interpreted. And when the Arcturians adjust a timeline, they often soften the emotional charge associated with certain memories, not removing them, but reducing their gravitational pull, so that your future is not unconsciously bent toward repeating unresolved patterns. This can manifest as sudden neutrality toward situations that once triggered strong reactions, or as a sense that certain old narratives no longer apply, even if you cannot yet articulate why. And this is a sign that the informational weight of those narratives has been reduced within your field. The mechanics behind this involve what could be described as phase alignment, where your emotional body, mental body, and intuitive awareness begin to oscillate at compatible frequencies, reducing internal interference and allowing intention to propagate more cleanly into experience. The Arcturians specialize in this kind of alignment because their own civilization evolved beyond survival-based consciousness long ago, forcing them to master the art of coherence as a means of collective stability. And it is this mastery they apply when interacting with developing consciousnesses like humanity. As the adjustment takes hold, you may notice that time itself feels different, not faster or slower in a mechanical sense, but more responsive, as if moments stretch when insight is available and compress when distraction arises. And this elasticity is another indicator that your timeline has been refined, because coherent timelines exhibit less resistance between intention and outcome. The universe in this state becomes less reactive and more reflective, mirroring your internal state with greater accuracy, which can feel empowering but also confronting, because there is less room to hide from oneself when distortion is removed. The Arcturians do not shield you from this clarity. Instead, they trust that readiness implies responsibility, and responsibility implies the capacity to navigate truth without collapse. One of the reasons this adjustment occurred overnight, rather than during waking consciousness, is that the rational mind often resists reconfiguration, clinging to familiar identities even when they no longer serve growth, whereas the subconscious operates closer to the quantum substrate, where change can be introduced without triggering defensive loops. In this way, sleep becomes a gateway not only for rest but for recalibration, a state where consciousness temporarily relinquishes control and allows the deeper architecture to be optimized. After the adjustment, signals from the future begin to feel more accessible, not as predictions but as intuitions about direction, because the refined timeline carries a clearer informational gradient, making it easier to sense which choices amplify coherence and which introduce noise. This can result in a growing intolerance for misalignment, where situations, relationships, or habits that once felt manageable now feel energetically heavy or incoherent, not because they suddenly became wrong, but because your field no longer resonates with them in the same way. The mechanics behind this are impersonal, not judgmental, because resonance is not morality but physics, and when frequencies diverge, separation occurs naturally. The Arcturians understand that this phase can feel isolating, which is why they often reinforce the adjustment with subtle confirmations, synchronicities that reassure the nervous system that it is safe to release the old and step into the unknown. These confirmations may arrive as unexpected clarity, timely information, or encounters that reflect your inner shift back to you, reinforcing trust in the process without demanding belief. As your timeline stabilizes, feedback loops tighten, meaning the time between intention and response shortens, and this can feel like accelerated manifestation, but it is more accurately described as reduced interference, because when internal contradiction dissolves, reality no longer needs to compensate through delay. The Arcturians do not promise ease, but they optimize efficiency, ensuring that energy invested in growth yields insight rather than exhaustion, and this efficiency is one of the hallmarks of a refined timeline. It is also why ignoring the adjustment can feel uncomfortable, because when a system is tuned for coherence, attempting to operate it through old patterns creates friction that is immediately noticeable, like forcing an instrument out of tune after it has been carefully calibrated. This discomfort is not punishment but feedback, an invitation to align behavior with the updated configuration of your field. Over time, as this chapter integrates, you may begin to recognize that the adjustment was not an external event imposed upon you, but a collaborative act between your readiness and a higher intelligence that responds precisely when that readiness becomes undeniable. The Arcturians did not choose the moment arbitrarily, they responded to a signal you emitted through sustained inner work, questioning, or even exhaustion, all of which contributed to the coherence necessary for intervention. This realization carries a quiet empowerment, because it reframes your life not as something that happens to you, but as something that responds to you at levels far deeper than conscious effort alone. The mechanics of the adjustment continue to unfold long after the night itself has passed, because a refined timeline is not a static state, but a dynamic process, continually recalibrating as you move through it, and the more you listen to its feedback, the more fluidly you will navigate the path ahead. This chapter, then, is not merely an explanation but a lens through which to interpret the sensations, insights, and subtle disruptions you may be experiencing now, all of which are signs that the universe is reorganizing around a clearer signal, one that you are now capable of sustaining. After the Arcturians adjusted your timeline overnight, the most revealing evidence did not arrive through dramatic visions or external announcements, but through subtle, persistent signals woven into your everyday awareness, because refined timelines announce themselves quietly, trusting that those who are aligned will notice without needing to be convinced. One of the first signs is a shift in inner dialogue, where thoughts that once circled endlessly now resolve more quickly, not because problems have vanished, but because the mental loops that fed them have lost their energy. Source. And this can feel like mental silence opening up between thoughts, a spaciousness that was previously inaccessible. In this space, intuition becomes more distinct, not as a sudden voice, but as a steady orientation, a sense of knowing which direction holds less resistance and more flow, and this orientation often contradicts old logic, creating a tension that signals the mind is adjusting to a more accurate map of reality. Emotional responses also begin to change, sometimes unpredictably, where situations that once provoked strong reactions now pass through you with minimal charge, while seemingly minor interactions suddenly feel significant, and this redistribution of emotional intensity is not random, but reflects a recalibration of relevance, as your system learns which signals actually matter on your refined path. Physical sensations can accompany this process, including waves of warmth, pressure around the head or chest, or a sense of expansion and contraction that moves through the body without clear cause. And while these sensations may tempt interpretation, they are best understood as the nervous system adapting to a cleaner informational flow, much like a circuit adjusting to a new voltage. Time perception often becomes one of the most noticeable indicators, as moments of presence feel richer and more dimensional, while periods of distraction seem to collapse or blur, creating the impression that time itself is responding to attention, and in a refined timeline, this impression is accurate, because coherence allows consciousness to interact more directly with temporal structure. Synchronicities begin to appear with greater frequency, but unlike earlier experiences, they no longer feel surprising or mystical. Instead, they carry a sense of inevitability, as if the universe is simply confirming what you already sensed internally, reinforcing trust without spectacle. Relationships also start to reflect the adjustment, sometimes through deepened resonance, where communication becomes easier and more authentic, or through sudden distancing, where connections dissolve without conflict, simply losing relevance as frequencies diverge. And while this can evoke mixed emotions, it is one of the clearest signs that your timeline has been refined, because relationships are among the most sensitive indicators of alignment. You may notice an increased sensitivity to environments, sounds, or media, where certain spaces feel nourishing while others feel draining almost immediately. And this heightened discernment is not fragility but precision, the natural outcome of reduced internal noise, which makes incoherence more noticeable. Dreams can become unusually vivid or instructive, not necessarily symbolic in the traditional sense, but experiential, leaving you with impressions rather than narratives. And these impressions often carry guidance that integrates seamlessly into waking awareness, further blurring the boundary between conscious and subconscious processing. Another sign is a growing discomfort with postponement, where delaying action on something you know internally begins to create physical or emotional tension. Because in a refined timeline, latency between knowing and doing generates friction, and this friction serves as feedback, urging alignment rather than compliance. At the same time, there may be an increased tolerance for uncertainty, a paradoxical calm in the face of not knowing outcomes, because the refined path carries an underlying sense of support, a quiet confidence that you are being met by the universe rather than abandoned within it. You might feel drawn to simplify aspects of your life, releasing clutter, habits, or commitments that once felt necessary, not through effort, but through a natural loss of interest, as if your system is shedding excess weight to move more efficiently along its new trajectory. This simplification extends to thought patterns, where overanalysis becomes tiring rather than compelling, and clarity feels more satisfying than explanation, signaling a shift from mental dominance toward integrated awareness. Creativity often resurfaces or intensifies, not necessarily as artistic expression, but as novel problem-solving, fresh perspectives, or spontaneous insights that seem to arrive fully formed, reflecting the increased coherence between subconscious processing and conscious awareness. You may also notice that external challenges arise shortly after the adjustment, not as setbacks but as calibration tests, offering opportunities to respond from your new orientation rather than old habits, and how you meet these moments can either stabilize or distort the refined timeline. The Arcturians anticipate this phase and do not intervene further unless necessary, trusting that the adjustment itself has provided sufficient clarity for self-navigation, because the goal is not dependency but autonomy within alignment. Ignoring these signs does not negate the adjustment, but it does introduce resistance, which can manifest as fatigue, irritability, or a vague sense of being out of sync. And these sensations are not failures but indicators that attention is being diverted from the path of least resistance. When you acknowledge the signs without obsessing over them, the timeline stabilizes more smoothly, and the feedback becomes gentler, reinforcing trust rather than urgency. Over time, the accumulation of these subtle confirmations creates a new baseline where alignment feels normal rather than exceptional, and this normalization is crucial because a refined timeline is not meant to be a peak experience but a sustainable mode of living. As this chapter integrates, you may realize that the most profound evidence of the adjustment is not any single sign, but the overall sense that your life is now responding to you with greater immediacy and honesty, reflecting your inner state with less delay and distortion. This responsiveness can feel both liberating and demanding because it leaves little room for self-deception, yet it also offers a level of support that was previously inaccessible, creating a relationship with the universe that feels interactive rather than indifferent. The Arcturians do not ask you to believe in them to validate this process. They rely on experiential recognition, trusting that the clarity emerging within you is sufficient proof of alignment. In this way, the signs you couldn't ignore are not messages from elsewhere, but reflections of a deeper synchronization now active within your own field, signaling that the timeline you are walking has indeed been adjusted, and that the universe is now listening to you with greater precision than ever before. Now here's the question for you. What part of the country are you watching this story from? Drop your state in the comments below.